Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, All Booked Up Care and Access for Book Collections. Before we jump into things, I just have a few housekeeping notes and community guidelines to mention. If you have any sound or technical issues today, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message, and I'll do my best to help you out. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent out to all of the registrants within the next week or so, probably. We just ask that you hold each other with mutual respect and come to this space teachable, and try to stay engaged with our presenters throughout the program. So now I just wanted to share a little bit about the Documentary Heritage Preservation Services for New York. DHPSNY, as we like to call it, is a collaboration between the New York State Archives and the New York State Library, with services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DHPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions, such as archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as this webinar. So to learn more about our services, you can visit us at DHPSNY.org. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Amanda to get us started.
Thanks, Leah. Welcome everyone to our webinar today, All Booked Up Care and Access for Books Collections. We're going to take a dive into preservation and access procedures for all of your rare book and special collections. So my name is Amanda Marie. I'm the program manager for DHPSNY, and I'm joined today by Eliza Gilligan, who is the senior book conservator at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. So thanks, Eliza, for joining me today. So here is our general lineup for the day. We'll talk through construction and materials and how that informs preservation, taking a closer look at environments, storage, and housing, and then we'll move on to access and handling, as well as exhibition, and wrap up with a chance to ask all of your questions of Eliza. So along the way, I'll be providing the foundational framework and asking Eliza to share her knowledge and insights about each topic as we go along. Feel free to type questions in the chat as they come up, and I'll try to catch them as they come in. Any that we don't get to during the presentation, we'll definitely have time for at the end. So to kick off our discussion, let's take a look at the materials and construction of books and begin thinking about how the unique materials and structural aspects of bound volumes inform preservation efforts. So I just wanted to review some of the terms that we'll be using today so you kind of have a sense of what we're referring to. Thinking about the different terms used in bookmaking, and first I wanted to touch on the text block. So that is collectively the handwritten, printed, or blank leaves of a book, that very central core of the book. And before the Industrial Revolution, those were made from folded down larger sheets of paper. So I don't know if any of you have ever come across the volumes with the uncut pages still in a book, but that's where that's coming from. There are end pages on either side of that text block, and those extra blank sheets are known as the flyleaf on either side. And in earlier methods of bookbinding, this end band at the top supported the head and tail, or the top and bottom of the spine. But these are more decorative and modern methods of bookbinding. And so later, as we talk about handling and removing books from shelves, we'll kind of talk about that weaker point in the head cap and how that changes how we approach these things. And the other term here that I just like us to pay attention to, just for directional purposes as we talk about handling and care, is the foredge, just being that front of the text block opposite the spine. And you'll hear me refer, I think, to some of those terms as we move through things today. So clearly there are many different types of materials that have been used in bookmaking over the years, and that's all dependent on the individual volume that you're looking at. So from early parchment and vellum to wood pulp and rag papers, thinking about covering materials such as cloth or leather, any book will inherently be composed of several different material types as a complex object. And so Eliza, when we last talked, you were telling me about how the type of paper, the type of construction, and the choice of covering materials can affect the stability of a bound volume. So I was hoping that you could speak to that a bit more for everyone here today.
Sure. Thanks, Amanda. So I think everybody who works with collections is probably aware of different books fall apart more readily, and they can sort of spot some of the visual cues, but maybe you don't know, why handmade paper is better than machine-made paper, or it's not obvious, but handmade paper back in the good old days was made with rags, and they were your clothing rags that were collected. When people threw them out, the rag man came and collected them and took them off to the paper maker, and the paper maker shredded them and made them into a pulp. And then we got gorgeous handmade paper that was made out of flax or cotton or hemp or linen, and it was incredibly durable. It was sized with usually animal gelatin, and so it was thick and sturdy. Now, as paper making science developed, people came up with a way of making paper out of ground wood, literally taking a tree stump and grinding it. And so you would have little bits of basically mulch that would get boiled with some caustic soda, and that pulp would be used to create paper. That is going to be more like what we see in a book like this, with today's modern book. The paper tends to discolor. We sort of recognize sort of a brown discoloration. It oxidizes. The paper fibers are much shorter and they become more brittle. You have to handle them more carefully. Also, as literacy and paper making and the Industrial Revolution took off, case binding was developed, where originally books, their covers, this cover would have been laced with a sewing support from that the book had been sewn on, would get laced into the cover. Nowadays, and probably starting in the 1830s, the case was made separately and then glued to the text block. This means that the cover to text attachment is just whatever spine linings and piece of paper that were used to case in the book. That makes the book much more fragile and makes careful handling of modern books much more important. So that's sort of onto book structure. And then the covering material, leather can be incredibly durable. As the centuries wore on and people were producing more books, sheep hide became more popular. Sheep hide has an inherent vice in that the layers of sheep leather, there are two layers. With the layer in the middle is where lanolin comes from. And so while that's great for wool, that's great for the sheep in terms of the oil production, it means that sheep leather is inherently much weaker and it tends to peel. And when you see a book bound in sheep leather, you'll see these sort of stripes peeling away. It means also that the covers are more likely to fall off. And then as cloth became more popular, a weaker cloth means a weaker cover to text attachment. And then you start to see things like torn head caps. You start to see spines falling off, whether from people mishandling the book or light damage. As the book sits on the shelf, the light hits it and then the spine fabric starts to degrade. So those are some basics that you may recognize in your own collection, and just a little bit of context about how and why that's happening. And back to Amanda.
Thanks so much, Eliza. So now that we've talked a little bit about the structure and makeup of our bound volumes, let's dive a little bit more into preservation. So obviously the environment in which we keep our collections has a huge impact on the longevity and stability of our materials. So I wanted to talk through each of these kind of bigger ideas in terms of environments and what you can do to help stabilize your collection. So of course, we're always talking about temperature and relative humidity and keeping those settings as stable as possible without large fluctuations. And we'll dive a little bit more in the next slide into the specifics of that. But obviously a really great measure to take to be monitoring for your temperature and relative humidity and really have an understanding of the environments in which you're storing your collections, because that can help you prepare for any additional measures that need to be taken, whether it's housings or changes in how you accommodate those environmental conditions. And then I think one of the biggest ones to consider in terms of impact on the entirety of your collection is ensuring that you have a sealed building envelope. So ensuring that windows and doors seal well, gaskets are replaced, ensuring that there's no minor holes any places where pests are getting in, and really just thinking about the building itself as a layer of protection for your collections. That sealed building envelope will really prevent a lot of those fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity, or help flatten them out a bit, and will give you a really big leg up on tackling some of these other parts of environments that we're thinking about. So it's a really important one. And then I think another step in thinking about regular maintenance and walkthroughs. So, making sure that maintenance tasks are tracked and planned for, and that things are regularly kept an eye on. Walking through spaces. I know some folks are with volunteer organizations and you might not be on site every day, but having someone regularly assigned to just walk through and look for any areas of issues so that they can be taken care of as soon as they arise. And then thinking about, as well, integrated pest management. So for those of you unfamiliar, integrated pest management is a method of pest management that is a non-chemical means of being really proactive about monitoring and taking care of any issues that arise very quickly. So I think in terms of preparing your environment for collection storage, just thinking about monitoring, using those glue board sticky traps, those little ones that you can set around, and checking them regularly, seeing what's in your collection and making sure there's nothing detrimental to paper materials in your collection or the leather materials in your collection for some of these bound volumes, and making a regular plan to check in on that and change those out. And then also, last but not least, thinking about housekeeping, having a regular plan for how you are dusting shelves and cleaning areas where collections are stored. Housekeeping can be a really proactive measure to ensure that no added dust or dirt is, affects the deterioration and stability of your collections. So I have a few more specifics on the next slide. Eliza, is there anything that you wanted to add before I move on to that?
I think, stable temperature and relative humidity is absolutely the baseline of a proper collection storage environment. And sure, it can be hard to achieve something that's close to an ideal, but it's worth the effort to do the best you can. If you have damp spaces in your collections during, say, the summer months when the relative humidity is high, see if you can get a dehumidifier in place, because putting that effort into, say, a dehumidifier that is then, obviously you want to have a plan for, say, draining the water, whether it's you run it, you have, maintenance staff who come through on a regular basis and drain the bucket, or you're able to pipe the drain to an actual drain that goes away from your collections area. Those sorts of efforts, the preventive maintenance, helps, because it is so much easier to deal with a dehumidifier than it is to deal with a collection that's grown mold, whether it's library collections or an artifact collection or mold in your walls, especially if you are, say, a self-insured institution or an institution who can't afford a whole lot in the way of a remediation bill. I think it can be daunting, but it's worth digging into. I think, again, maintenance in terms of like keeping the windows sealed, keeping collection storage areas clean, making the effort to make sure that any incoming collections aren't carrying in bugs with them. I think making sure that collections aren't stored on the floor helps tremendously. And then with regard to integrated pest management, the sticky traps, they aren't there just to tell you when to to spray, insecticide. It's to tell you, oh, if we have this kind of bug, then we've got a humidity problem in this corner of the collection area. Or if we've got that kind of bug and it only shows up in the summertime, well, then maybe we talk to the grounds crew and see if their leaf blowing or their mulching is stirring up a particular type of bug. It's so that you can use it as a tool to communicate with other people who are helping take care of your building. Also, it can help you make a case for, hey, we've got a lot of crickets coming in the collection storage area, see months and months and months of crickets in our sticky traps. Could we have some door sweeps, please? And sometimes it is just as simple as getting door sweeps put on the exterior doors. So those are just a couple of practical comments.
That was really great. Thanks, Eliza. Yes, I have some here somewhere on one of these slides, document, but anything that we can monitor, track, that can help us advocate for collection needs and staff needs is really wonderful. All right, so let's take a deeper dive into thinking about storage of course, as a preventative measure of support, so we don't end up causing more damage. So again, we're going to aim for good temperature and relative humidity settings. And so you'll see on the right-hand side here, I have the environmental guidelines put forth by the American Institute for Conservation. And so these are a general range within which hopefully your collection set points will fall. And the idea is to have your own set points, accommodate for, for those of you not in New York, I'm not sure where you're all located, but for those of us in New York, we have obviously some great seasonal fluctuations. And so all of that is expected, but really looking to make sure that you aren't exposing your collections to really high temperatures or really high relative humidity, or, on the other side of that, really low relative humidities for extended periods of time. And so these ranges are just kind of a guideline within which, hopefully your ideal collection goals will fall. Books, and Eliza can probably expand on this a little bit, but books are much more susceptible to high relative humidity than they are to higher temperatures. And so really, I know a lot of folks that may not even be monitoring for relative humidity. Some systems only monitor for the temperature. And so I think it's important to start, if you're not already, taking a look at what your relative humidity settings are, or even just monitoring to see what they are if you don't have a system that controls that, to make sure that you have an understanding of the space they're in. And as Eliza said, add a dehumidifier, or even just have a sense of what's happening with your collections can be really helpful. And then, of course, as we've talked about with pests and with temperature and relative humidity, monitoring our storage environments. And one of those parts of things that we can monitor for as well is light. And so I did include a chart here. We're going to talk about light exposure for materials a bit more when we talk about exhibition as a major part of that. But I did include here some general light levels that are, kind of goals to aim for. And certainly in storage, we're looking for much lower light levels, lights turned off when you're not in collection spaces, those types of things to limit that light damage to materials as much as possible. And thinking about storage furniture and having appropriate storage furniture can go a really long way to adding stability for your collections. So metal shelving is ideal. If you have wooden shelves, it's really a great idea to think about lining those with maybe museum board or something like that. But also if you have things in boxes or wrappers, that will add a level of protection for those materials. Making sure that shelving is wide enough to accommodate the full size of those materials, whether you have oversized materials or standard sizes that are stored vertically, ensuring that shelving fully supports those volumes. And then using bookends to support rows and avoiding slumping or leaning materials in storage. And I would also recommend avoiding using the top shelf. I know some of those units have that top shelf that puts things really high up next to ceilings that might have any kind of HVAC piping or things like that running above it. It's a really great measure to keep things below that top level so that you have a shelf top between your materials and any of that kind of infrastructure that might be above it. So Eliza, we kind of referenced this already, but ideal storage conditions are often really hard to achieve on a limited budget or within the confines of a larger building and operations goals if you share a building within your organization. So what would be your recommendations for some first steps that could be more beneficial to collections overall?
I think if you monitor your collections, I think that's really helpful if you document conditions and then when you talk to your facilities people, you can compare them with their information. Most HVAC systems do have some sort of monitoring system that is internal that tells the facilities people what's going on at any given time. And you can use that as a basis of comparison to say, well, we're trying to achieve X, Y, and Z, and we're getting these readings. What are you getting at these times? And that's a way to start a conversation, as opposed to going up to your facilities person and saying, hey, why aren't we getting what we need? I think that's a good first step. I think if you have problem areas where collections could be vulnerable, then housings become even more important, so that if there are fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity, a box made of corrugated board could provide a good layer of insulation for collections that could be sensitive, especially if they're vellum, or especially if they're photographs, especially if they're like photo albums where that's sort of multimedia components. I think a housing can go a long way to mitigate a collection situation that isn't ideal.
Great, thank you. And I would just add too, for those of you without HVAC systems, monitoring is again a really wonderful first step, and that sealed building envelope can be really impactful. And also give you a lot of data if you're seeing swings in temperature or relative humidity. Maybe it'll go towards advocating for the addition of some equipment to better control environments in your space if you can give that data. So great point, Eliza. All right, so we started to talk about just now, there's a great segue into thinking about providing supportive housings for our collections, and that being another layer of protection that we can provide to bound volumes. So I've included here just like a short list of some options. Obviously, the easiest to tackle might even just be a paper wrapper of a volume that is unstable or has missing covers or loose pieces, just to give it some kind of a little bit of additional support if that volume is not often used. For volume that you're pulling a lot and using a lot, there are some more structured supports that you can create for those, including phase boxes that can be handmade, or even thinking about commercially sourced standard size boxes and adding spacers for books that may be not a standard size, but just think about the time commitment that you have to devote to creating housings versus the idea of buying the commercially made things that may help you house a lot of things more efficiently. So it's definitely a balancing act and something to think through as you endeavor on these projects. So considerations to consider: thinking about stability of the volume, storage orientation and size. Is this an oversized volume that's going to have to be stored horizontally? Or do we just need to provide some stability as it's vertically stored on a shelf? Thinking about pre-made or handmade containers, whether you have time and resources to devote to making individually specifically sized housings for your collection, or whether you want to go with some pre-made standard sizes that you could create spacers for. And then thinking about whether your collection is finite or growing. So is this something that you're going to have to add housings to later, or do you have a finite collection that you can house all together in one box? And so we'll show an example of that, if I haven't already, of miniature books that Eliza shared with me. And then thinking about also as well, whether you're just looking for support for volumes that will be in storage for the long term, whether you also need something that enables access, so enables handling and protection of that volume as folks are looking at it and using it. So Eliza, I know you have another housing idea that you wanted to share. So I will give you space to do that, and then I have another
Sure.
question for you.
So this option sort of goes to the, you need something right away, you need an inexpensive option, and it's more on the paper wrapper end of the spectrum. So what I've got here is a regular manila envelope, and I have cut off the corners. And I have cut off the corners because I have a book that it's not that thick, but let's pretend that this book, normally it wouldn't need a box, it wouldn't need much. It's in really good condition, except, oh dear, the dust jacket got mangled somehow, and we want to save the dust jacket. Now, yeah, you could get a Mylar wrapper for the dust jacket, but maybe this concept meets some other needs in your collection, say a collection of pamphlets, something that doesn't have a dust jacket, but the cover got torn. You take a file folder that used to be intact. I cut it to size, and you can cut it with an X-Acto knife. And so that will keep the dust jacket or any loose bits on the binding from getting snagged. And then you can house it in an envelope. And I'm going to have to put it down flat so I can slide it in. But by cutting off the corners of the envelope, that releases the thickness of the envelope enough so that it can accommodate the thickness of the book, and the bottom of the envelope can sit flat on the shelf. And you can write the call number on the envelope, or you can stick a book flag in the envelope with the title and call number information, and it can sit on the shelf next to its buddies and not be severely impacted. So these envelopes of a couple different sizes, if you have thinner things, if you have things that have tattered covers, this can be a really handy, inexpensive option that doesn't quite require a lot of equipment or technical expertise to put into place. And then other things to keep in mind, I think Amanda alluded to how to choose your housings. If you have, let's say you get a big donation, and you're gonna have to plan to house it, or you're gonna have to, as you're doing, say, an archival processing phase before you shelve it. If it's a bunch of things of similar size, absolutely go ahead and order pre-made housings from a vendor. I think that's a great way to go, because people are busy. People have more to do on their list than hours in the day. And yes, it can take money, but unless you have the skill sets and the equipment and the space to make consistently high quality housings, it generally isn't cost effective. Glue is expensive, materials are expensive, people's time is expensive. So even though I'm someone who can make all kinds of custom housings and I really enjoy it, I do believe in purchasing the sort of the pre-made and adjustable ones. It can make your archival processing go a lot faster and your shelving process go a lot more smoothly.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Eliza. And I was remiss in including a photo of some of those kind of like pre-bought book boxes on here, but you can get them from most library and archival suppliers, and just looking for acid-free, lignin-free materials in your housings and ensuring that they kind of conform to those standards. I will say, for those who are really excited about making housings and maybe have like one or two books in their collection that they'd really like to make them, I did include some resources at the end, and a couple of them are instructions on how to make some phase boxes. So there is that option as well there if you want to take a look when you receive the slides. So Eliza, can I ask you to speak a little bit to, and I didn't give you fair warning on this one, but thinking about buffered versus unbuffered housing materials and what considerations we should keep in mind for bound volume specifically, if there's like one to lean into for most materials, or if there's any reason we would use the other.
It's all good. I mean,
okay.
Yeah, I think if you can afford it, you know, I can't remember if buffered is more expensive than unbuffered, but I think the most important thing is a housing that keeps out dust and light and keeps all the pieces together, allows for easy handling and good labeling.
Great, thank you. All right. So speaking of labeling, you keep making these transitions so easy, Eliza. We wanted to touch just briefly on ways to label your bound volumes, since they do pose some different challenges than other materials might. So thinking about options such as book flags, which you can see on the left-hand side photo with the miniature books, pretty standard book flags, strips of paper cut to, or more cardstock cut to size, and including any identifying information or barcodes, as well as on, of course, the right, just labeling the housings or wrappers. And as Eliza showed in her housing example, there's a lot of different housings that would allow for that. Thinking about, you know, lightly inscribing in pencil on the inside cover to ensure that you can track your materials. Or also there is the link included on this slide is a method of using poly straps to mark the identifying information on your volumes. And so Eliza, I didn't know if you wanted to speak a little bit more to the idea of the poly straps and how that
Sure.
might be really beneficial, and what other labeling tips and tricks you might have to share as well.
So obviously considerations differ whether we're talking about books in circulating collection and you are not making a commitment to perpetual retention of, you know, the Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's whatever. If the book is going to be circulating, then you can put barcodes all over it. You can put spine labels, either sealant or the zebra labels, with, you know, whatever works best for your collection. Now, for special collections material, there are some more considerations. You don't want to put a pressure sensitive adhesive sticker anywhere on the book, and that's why the book flags are really handy. On the front you can write the call number, and then on the back you can put that barcode. Now in the picture, that's a miniature book, and those barcodes are actually mini barcodes. So they're, I don't know, like 1/3 the size of a standard barcode. ACRL, if you Google or you go to ACRL or through the ALA website, they have really great guidelines on security and marking practices for special collections, using a permanent stamp to property stamp your books, and good places to put those permanent property stamps so that if someone steals your book, you have a way to get it back. Because otherwise, you know, so that people can't easily remove the property stamp. And security is a part of preservation. You do want to pay attention to careful handling, not just for the sake of the durability of the book, but you don't want somebody to mutilate it and either cut out a pretty picture or cut out a picture they don't like. So do take a look at those ACRL standards. They're freely available on their website, and you know, they're an important part of preservation. Now back to labeling, which is what Amanda asked me to talk about first. The Benchmark catalog, they are an exhibit vendor, and they have a really nifty product called Polystrap, which is a polyethylene plastic that is kind of, it's as inert as Mylar, but it's much softer. And so you can do a loop of polystrap around, say, the back board of the book, and then put your barcode on the poly strap. But so when you handle the book, the barcode's right there, and it's makes it really convenient for handling, for shelving, for checking out the book if someone's going to use it in your reading room. And the poly strap is also useful in exhibits, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So back to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Eliza. And that's a really great, the ACRL's good resource. I will make sure that I track down that link and add it to the resource.
Yeah,
I can out. So everyone has that as well. All right, so with that, we are going to dive into thinking about access for our collections. And so just, you know, I've written in some pretty basic recommendations for handling rare books. Obviously, these can be built on and certainly should be for your organization. If you have handling guidelines in place, you can write things more specifically. Seeing some things in the chat, so I'm just going to pull that up real quick. All right. So thinking about taking care in removing books from shelves, being sure to not pull books down by that head cap, again, to prevent any deterioration along the spine, pushing volumes back on either side. And of course, if we're stacking oversized volumes horizontally, lifting them off one at a time and avoiding abrading those covers or collapsing a pile of things as we pull things out from the middle. Being aware of prior damage can go a long way. So if you're pulling materials for researchers, just taking a look through whether it's in a housing or not, just looking for broken bindings, fragile text blocks, deteriorated or crumbling edges, anything that you can notice that might be an issue. You can help train a researcher or discuss with a researcher on how to best handle that, and also provide good supports for them. And as always, the question of gloves. And at this point, the thinking is that clean hands are best. So if you have volumes that have, flaking media or red rot, and you want that protection for yourself, you can definitely use nitrile gloves. But cotton gloves really limit dexterity and can cause damage. So clean hands as you're looking through bound volumes is really the great first step. And of course, if you're looking at photographic materials or metal objects, we always recommend using nitrile gloves for those types of materials. And then to dive in a little bit more in terms of providing access to bound volumes, of course, handling with care, avoiding putting any strain on book spines. And so you'll see I have a note about duplication as well. I know a lot of folks are asked to make photocopies of books or pages. And so just considering how much strain you're putting on the spine as you're photocopying, if that book can't handle laying flat on a photocopier, considering a copy stand to take a photograph of something for reproduction or sharing. And then being sure that you have the proper supports available in your reading room or access space. So thinking about book cradles, weights to help hold down pages as folks are looking at things. Using book trucks to move bound volumes, a lot of the same rules that apply for other materials in access and reading rooms. Thinking about pencils only, limiting other materials that are brought into your space, and keeping table space clear. So again, our goal is to minimize damage and refrain from overhandling as much as possible. So thinking about planning ahead for where volumes are moving from, where they're moving to, and how you can help researchers access them safely. So I didn't know, Eliza, if you had anything you wanted to add to thinking about handling and access at all.
Just everyone, I'm probably not supposed to endorse vendors, but it is really hard to find book snakes or weights, like string weights. I get these from Joann, $1 a yard. They're not listed on the website. You have to go in and look around in the curtain weight section. They're usually on a spool. So I just go in. It's a pain in the butt that they don't list them online, but otherwise they're very expensive. So that's my one vendor endorsement. So yeah.
I love it. All right. So let's dive into exhibition then. So of course, part of access is, providing access to these materials and exhibition, a really effective way to reach additional visitors and help more folks see within your collections. And so, as with the majority of our preservation best practices, there are set national and international standards that a lot of the things that you'll hear us talk about are pulled from. And so when we're talking about exhibiting library and archival materials, one of those standards that we're pulling from is the ANSI NISO Z39.79-2001 environmental conditions for exhibiting library and archival materials. And so you can purchase this full standard online if you want a copy, but here we've just kind of summarized some of the main key takeaways to think about as you're exhibiting materials. And I'm going to let Eliza speak to some specific examples. But in general, I think limiting light exposure for paper materials on display for no more than 12 weeks, if possible, to rotate exhibitions or turn pages of your bound volume so that there's no single page exposed for longer periods of time. There are some specifications here for the light levels in general between 50 and 100 lux for bound volumes on display, and reducing or eliminating light when exhibition areas are not in use, and avoiding direct sunlight. So thinking about where your displays are, if they're near windows, you can use curtains or other window coverings, and really just thinking about limiting light as much as possible. Light damage is cumulative and irreparable. So anything that you are, any light damage that you are getting on your materials is, we want to just limit that as much as possible. And so then you'll see that these environmental recommendations are a little bit different than what we talked about earlier in terms of storage, because we are talking about an environment where people will be a lot of the time. So keeping below 72 degrees Fahrenheit or cooler if possible, and keeping RH relative humidity between 35 and 50% as possible is the recommendation from the standard for exhibition. And again, I know we've talked about it several times, but thinking about monitoring for environmental conditions and pests in your exhibition areas can help give you a lot of information about what your materials are being exposed to and what precautions you might want to take in the future. And then thinking about ensuring, again, that we're providing basic supports. So not opening books more than 120 degrees, supporting the full width of the cover, and using text blocks as cradles as needed to really support these volumes on display. And of course, as I said, I promised I had a line that talked about documenting, but documenting what materials you're putting on display, for how long they're on display, and letting those materials rest in between exhibitions so that they can have some, limited light exposure for a while in storage is very important. And with that, I'm going to, Eliza, I want to leave it open for any kind of suggestions you have in terms of exhibition and providing support, but also thinking that you have, you provided some great photo examples for us on this slide in the last one. And so giving space to kind of speak a bit more about those examples and any things you wanted to draw out from that.
Sure. From the previous slide, I just wanted to point out that the book pictured was on exhibit for 40 years. Don't do that. You'll see that if the pages in the back, obviously the book was bound, so those pages were in the same exhibit environment, but they didn't receive any light exposure. And then the really, really brown pages were the ones that received the light exposure. That just shows you what light can do. And that if you keep your collections, out of the light, they'll actually look really great. That book is a whaling log book, so it spent most of its working life on a ship and not in the best conditions. But the light exposure is what really did a number on those 2 pages. The pages were also really, really dusty and gross. So most of my treatment was just like dry cleaning those 2 pages. So you can go on to the next slide. So if you look at the pamphlet in the sort of the back picture, and you'll see the sort of clean stripe down the side, that is from Mylar that was used to strap the pamphlet open. And again, this pamphlet had been on exhibit for several years. And I don't know if you can make it out, but the 3rd column, or the first full column from the right margin of the photo, says, "When in the course of human events." That's a pamphlet with the report in London of the Declaration of Independence. And it's a very important pamphlet. It was on display for way too long. I'm not going to tell you where, but don't do this. The light exposure will cause all kinds of problems for your collections. You can see that the Mylar, where it did filter out the effects of light. There was no UV exposure to this pamphlet, but that doesn't mean light damage won't happen. And it also doesn't mean just put sheets of Mylar over everything. So that's one reason you want to consider rotating pages, or putting an original on exhibit for a couple of months and then putting a facsimile in place if you absolutely have to have that image available to your viewing public. Turning the pages on a book are also important on exhibit if you want to avoid preferential page openings. So if you have a book open in the same place for several years, that book is going to fall open at that spot. So don't just pick 3 pages in the same, one after the other, because you will get a preferential page opening, or you will weaken the spine and the sewing. This is also another reason that when you do polystrap a book open, you want to polystrap where the text isn't. Do it on the margins along the foredge, just so that you don't have any risk of having a stripe through one of the columns of text. And then the back, you're seeing a back of something down in the picture. That was just a sample of a back and wrap, which I think is like one of the best exhibit packages ever. And I know we're supposed to be talking about books, but library collections never have just books. And so if you need to exhibit something flat, back it with a piece of mat board, put the artifact on the mat board, and then wrap it in Mylar, and you can hold the Mylar down with double stick tape. And there's a conservagram out there with directions, and I'll give Amanda the link to that. And you'll have it available to you after the webinar.
Great, thanks, Eliza. So we are reaching about 2:45, and so the next portion of our program here is asking questions of Eliza. So I have a couple that came in ahead of time, and one from the chat from earlier that I want to put out there, but I'll start with those. So if you have questions in mind, start typing them in the chat, and I'll start kind of throwing them out for Eliza. So Eliza, our first question here came in from Jameson, and this is their county's minute book of the inferior court around the 1850s to the 1860s that was badly water damaged, and it's the only item in their collection in this state, so they're not really sure what happened. I'm sure a lot of you see materials that come in that are previously damaged from storage or incidents that happened before it came into your collection. And so the question is, in the lower right, they have a photo of photocopies that someone made of the book to try and provide some more access to it. So they at least have that backup. But also is really hard to decipher. So the question is there any way to restore some clarity and make the text more legible?
So I would say that the person who did the photocopying was sort of on the right track. It's just that technology wasn't there at that point. This is something where scanning would be really great, because you can scan the fragile pages and or see if there's a way to light it a certain way to highlight the materials in the iron gall ink, and just see what you get. It is much more, you can manipulate an image much more easily than you can manipulate a mold and water damaged page.
Great, thank you. And my follow-up question, based on, what the state of some materials that have had water damage are, Eliza, is what are some red flags to keep an eye out for if you have materials that have had previous water damage, or there's been, some sort of water incident or moisture exposure in these materials? Is there something in particular that you would keep an eye out for as you're thinking about making sure you're preventing mold and pests and those types of things?
Well, you do need to dry things out very thoroughly. You have to make sure that everything is dry, whether that means you send it to a freeze dry vendor, or whether it happened long ago and you know that it's dried out. But keep in mind that alive or dead mold is an allergen, and people can react to mold either live or dead, and that's nothing you want to have spreading around your collections, whether it's in an archival processing area, or whether it's in a workroom, or whether it's in a collection storage. So just be really careful of those materials. When we bring them in to work on in the center, every box is labeled, everything is handled very carefully so that nothing spreads, so that no one gets exposed inadvertently. So if something has mold exposure or has severe mold damage, think very carefully about your ability to retain it and preserve it. If need be, scan it and then only allow access to the scanned images. It's something that you've just got to be very careful of.
Thank you. All right, so to some questions that are coming into the chat. So Kristen was saying having trouble applying for some grant funding. Kristen, if you are in New York State, please reach out to me and we can chat and see if there's anything else that the DHPSNY team can recommend for you to reach out for. The question for you, Eliza, is what they have some materials, historical legal items that are housed in the stack with just no regard whatsoever for kind of storage. So the question is, what cheap steps can they take to save these items, some of which date back to 1562, and how to, any tips on advocating for collections beyond what we've kind of already addressed so far?
So I think, let's see. So items from 1542 are probably going to be in better condition than your law books from 1920. I think if these items are housed in your stacks, then you're, again, keeping your whole stacks area in good shape will be the best first step for taking care of these books. I think documenting from a grant review perspective, documenting that these items aren't available anywhere else to researchers in the state of New York would probably be a big boost. If things are widely available, then it's like, well, why should we give you money to duplicate an effort? But if these are unique, if they, as a collection, provide a unique window onto legal history, then that I think would help with a grant application. I think those are the things I can think of off the top of my head. Also, if some take a look at pre-made enclosures. If some of them do need boxes, there are vendors out there that make boxes for like $30 a piece. That's, you know, a custom box, that's possible. If they're smaller, you can get pamphlet binders and custom ones where you sort of adjust the thickness. And so those are really inexpensive, comparatively inexpensive ways to hold pieces of a fragile book together until a more significant intervention can happen.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we often say if you can do nothing else, get it in a box to provide some protection. All right, so the next question that came in from Bridget is they've inherited a collection with several bound volumes wrapped in muslin and tissue paper. Is this okay to leave, or should they consider removing those wrappings?
I would get rid of the muslin and tissue paper, unless it was placed there by you know, the previous owner with a particular intent. Muslin and tissue paper isn't going to do anything except make it hard to handle.
All right, and then next question from Lindsay is, what is a good way to preserve or stabilize books that are missing just a front or backing board or both boards?
If you can cut archival board to the right shape and sort of stick it in there. So let's pretend this front cover is missing, and let's pretend that, you know, this is archival board. I would just cut a piece and then sort of put it in place, or get a box if you can afford a box and have a workflow that can get you a box or a 4-flap enclosure. This book is just a little, or it's maybe like just on the cusp of fitting a pre-made 4-flap enclosure that I'm thinking of from the vendor I'm not mentioning, but this book is. So I hope that helps.
Great. And I think our next question was, can you recommend good resources, online or not, for rare book repairs?
Well, that is something I do at the center. So I think, you know, Amanda, I don't know whether you talk about that in your work, but the Conservation Center does do work on rare books or not rare books. We work on all kinds of books. We work on all kinds of art on flat paper. We work on photographs. So yeah, you can ask Amanda about that process, and she can help you do a follow-up after the webinar.
Yeah, I think my follow-up question, Eliza, is, you know, I think there are certain things that are great preventative measures to tackle in-house, and there are also things that are really good to consult a conservator about before you dive into making any modification, long-lasting changes to your your rare books. And so I don't know if you have, I'm sure there's a whole long list of them, but are there any off the top of your head that are like, you know, like for me, mold or anything that you would have to introduce water into it in terms of like repairing something, are things to definitely consult a conservator for? So is there anything that you can think of in terms of like, if you see this in your collection, find a conservator to go talk to?
Well, I would think mold is obviously one where it's like you want to go talk to your facilities people, talk to a conservator, talk to a remediation specialist. Probably before you talk to a conservator, if you spot mold, I mean, you could talk to someone like Amanda or someone from a field services setting who could guide you on the next steps, because if it's a big problem, it wouldn't be one conservator you bring in, it would be a remediation company. If you have a donor who comes to you and says, oh, I've got this great collection I would like to give to you, that is also a good time where you want to bring in a conservator or maybe a collection specialist like Amanda or someone on her team who would say, well, it is a great collection, but would you consider donating some money to, pay for processing or pay for housing? So that, and of course, I've worked in libraries long enough to know that most donors just want you to back up your truck and take everything away. But I think it is important to at least try to make the case that donated collections are not free. They cost money to the collecting institution, and that if you can recoup some sort of funding to pay for archival processing, to pay for cataloging, to pay for housing, or even an inventory, hire an intern, hire a student to do some sort of primary intervention. I think that's really important.
Great, thanks, Eliza. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I am going to just jump forward a little bit here in terms of showing you all. There is the resources slide here, and so we'll send this to you. I'll add those couple of others from Eliza and make sure they're included as you get these slides in the next couple of weeks. And also I've included here contact information for us here at DHPSNY if you have any questions, if you want to follow up from this webinar with any question that you didn't get to, or feel comfortable asking in the chat, feel free to reach out to us. And if it's a question specifically for Eliza, we can connect you to her. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you so much, Eliza, for sharing all of your insights with us. I think it's been really beneficial. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Yay, bye.